Okay, it looks like that the webinar is now live, and for those of you that are just signing on, welcome to the Florida Veterans for Common Sense monthly meeting. I will say that in the future, we're going to start trying to have meetings in live and in person because so many of us are vaccinated now, and if we do social distancing, we should be able to do that. But we're going to try to figure out how to do it so that we can do it with Zoom at the same time, because there's people around the state that like to participate now. One advantage of COVID is that more people can participate by Zoom, and so we'll try to do it both ways. But we couldn't get that ironed out for this month's meeting, so that's what we're going to try to do next month. If you do have a comment tonight or a question, you can send them through Richard and Richard Scissors, and you can do that in the question and answer box. So that's what Richard's going to be monitoring. So at this point, we'll get started and do the Pledge of Allegiance. Rich, if you can bring up the flag.
I'm trying to do.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America.
One nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, Jim. And now okay, well, what we'll do then, we'll go ahead with the introduction of our speaker tonight, who we're really, really fortunate to have our own member giving the talk tonight, and he is more than qualified to give this talk. Jack is one of our hardest working members, and there's not a meeting that I'm ever involved with that Jackson participating in when he doesn't have some really good ideas. And you can see when you hear his resume, I'm going to give you just a brief overview of this, but it's very impressive. Number one, Jack's a Florida native. There's not too many of those around, but there's a few. And but that gives him a good historical perspective, because so many people have moved into Florida recently. They really don't have an overview of what's happened with our state. He's educated in natural sciences from USF. He has a master's degree. He did something that there's no way you could pay me enough money to do it, and that he served as a submariner. So he's an active member of our group as a former submariner. He was the staff director of the Florida House of Representatives Committee on Natural Resources, the Florida Department of Natural Resources Bureau of Geology, a senior biologist in mine reclamation. That's very important for this talk tonight. Florida Department of Natural Resources Assistant Bureau Chief, State Lands Management. With the St. John's Water Management District, he was the director of the Department of Natural Science. He was the environmental manager, Sarasota and Hillsborough counties. And currently, he's an instructor in climate change adaptation and mitigation at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Ringling College. So Jack, welcome.
Thanks. Okay, can I screen share?
Yes, you should be able
to. All right. And let me go to full screen here. Nope. Sorry there.
We're there. It looks good, Jack.
Okay, yeah, it kicked me forward for some reason. All right. Piney Point and phosphate mining in general. Piney Point's only one of the disasters we've had in phosphate mining, and it's definitely one of the many political failures. And Rich asked if I could talk a little bit about history of phosphate mining in Florida, and some solutions to Piney Point or again, Piney Point is a representative of a much larger problem in Florida with phosphate mining. So when we look at the history of phosphate mining in Florida, phosphate was first discovered in South Carolina In Florida, it was discovered in Alachua County in 1880. We started mining pebble and boulder phosphate, and now we're doing matrix, which is a combination of phosphate rock mixed with sand and clay. And we're using drag lines and dredges. And phosphate ore is separated at a beneficiation plant from the sand and clay. And the phosphates then pumped to a fertilizer processing plant, which is what was at Piney Point. And it's advancing itself here. This is the early mining in Florida. And maybe I won't even have to change the slides here. This was the early days in the early 1900s, and they even used dredges. And we currently have some dredging going on. Here's how we're doing it today. This is a drag line for a mosaic. There's a truck in the background, and look at the bucket on the front of that thing. And the next slide will be two guys standing in the bed in that bucket. And you get some idea of the size of these drag lines and the immensity of what we are doing with the mining. So I'm just going to flash through really quick a number of scenes of the mining going on, and you can see what it ends up being. Some of our mines are mandatorily reclaimed, and a lot of them are not, and I'll show a map in a little bit of that. So here's the moonscape that's left when we're done mining, and it has not been reclaimed. This is in the Mayaca Basin, the one mine in the Mayaca Basin, the Wingate mine, and it's using a dredge, which is right there, to excavate the mine. This is a map of all of the phosphate mining in Florida. The red is the mandatory reclamation areas. The gray is non-mandatory. Brown hasn't been mined yet. These gold spots are the phospho gypsum stacks, and that's Piney Point right there, one of 24 to 27. I've heard different numbers, about 1 billion tons of phospho gypsum stored in those 24 phospho gypsum stacks, and we're adding about 30 tons per year. These are all of the named mines in the state of Florida. And when I was working at Sarasota County, we got involved in a challenge to that Fort Greene mine there. So phosphate rock is dredged, is removed with that drag line. It's sent to the washer plant, the beneficiation plant, where the clay is separated and put into a huge clay settling area, much the size. They are basically mountains like the phosphogypsum stacks. And then the phosphate rock additionally contains uranium, which decomposes into radium and then radon gas. And the American Chemical Society, some years back, did a report where they said that responsible extraction of uranium should consider the social and environmental impact of mining and the potential legacy costs. And this is precisely what we ought to be doing with phosphate mining and are not doing. And originally, uranium was actually removed from the phosphate mining process. And so the U.S. Department of Energy, Office of Nuclear Energy, said that in the late 1990s, we stopped mining uranium from the phosphoric acid. And they looked at the 2014 data and said we could have gotten more uranium, could have been recovered than actually was removed, was achieved from the domestic mine products. And instead, we have a waste product that is making our phosphogypsum stacks radioactive, if you will. And they said that to be economically attractive, recovery costs would have to fall, or the price of uranium would have to increase to go back to extracting that uranium from the phosphoric acid plants. And so the phosphate processing results in the phosphogypsum stacks that convert the phosphate rock to phosphoric acid by treating it with sulfuric acid, an extremely strong acid. Hence, the stacks end up being very acid. It's combined with ammonia, and we end up with diammonium phosphate, which is a water-soluble fertilizer. It therefore could end up in our bay quite easily. And the other products, we have the sulfuric acid, the phosphate combined to make phosphoric acid, and we end up with calcium sulfate, which is the phosphogypsum. And the phosphogypsum stacks now contain the calcium sulfate, gypsum. Our wall boards are made out of gypsum, and it's used as an agricultural additive. And it contains radionuclides in many instances, most instances, and a very strong acid. So the hazards of that nitrogen that I just mentioned, the ammonia, to discharges to Florida's waters, are that Florida's estuaries and many of our lakes are nitrogen limited. That means that the more nitrogen we add, the more algae we grow. And so, and one of those algae that likes to eat that nitrogen is the red tide organism. And nitrogen is recycled through many different forms. And because of that, it's really hard to track through an ecosystem. So we may not be able to prove the impacts of the Piney Point discharges on algae blooms and red tide. And right now we are seeing red tide along the Southwest Florida coast, and in many instances areas that would not be affected by Piney Point. But I saw just today that that they are now finding some red tide even up into Hillsborough County. There's a gyp stack, a phosphogypsum stack, to give you some perspective. They range at Piney Point about only 70 feet high, and many of them are as much as 200 feet high. And here's what Florida looks like. For those of you that may not know, we are sitting on a bed of limestone, and those gyp stacks are built on this bed of limestone. And when we mix acid and limestone, if you have ever done a baking soda and vinegar, you know that it dissolves. And that's precisely what has happened numerous times now in Florida. And that's why we are particularly in danger from the continuation of building phosphogypsum stacks and continuing to add more to the 24 that we already have. And here's the result. This was in Mulberry. There's a helicopter hovering over there, if you can see it up here, to give you some sense of the perspective. That is not a small crack or a small pinhole in the ground. That is a huge hole that basically can swallow an entire gyp stack, phosphogypsum. As we look at the history of phosphogypsum stacks in Florida, are they safe? Well, the first spill that I could find was in 1977 in Mulberry. And then in 1994, that sinkhole that I just showed opened up and basically swallowed the phosphogypsum stack. 1997, heavy rain caused the failure of a stack and the discharge of 56 million gallons of very acidic water down the Alafia River, where it pretty well killed everything for 42 miles. In 2001, the Piney Point started leaking, and it caused the Mulberry Phosphate Company to file bankruptcy, and the Florida Department of Environmental Protection took over. Then in 2004, Hurricane Francis set up waves on top of the pond on a phospho gypsum stack in Riverview, causing it to fail and discharge into Archie Creek. And then in 2006, HRK buys Piney Point from the state. And in the intervening years, Port Manatee needs to dredge new channels, and they are out of dredge spoil locations. So they contract with HRK to put dredge spoil into a Piney Point phospho gypsum pond, and it was lined for that purpose, and the liner ripped and 170 million gallons were released, causing HRK to file for bankruptcy. Then in 2016, a different gypsum stack in Mulberry had a sinkhole that swallowed it, and 215 million gallons of acidic water went into our aquifer. And again, if you remember the picture of the state of Florida, our drinking water is recharged in the highest points in Florida. And so that's towards the central part of the state. So when we put toxic materials into the central part of the state, into the aquifer, it's even more dangerous than it is when we do it right here along the coastline, because fresh water in the aquifer tends to move towards the coast. And now in 2021, we have a Piney Point leak that caused the discharge of 200 million gallons of acidic water that was extremely high in nitrogen. And again, we are nitrogen limited. Adding that nitrogen is just what we need to set off algae blooms, including feeding red tide. And so we may be in for another bad red tide year as we go forward. As the Port of Manatee was looking for places to put their dredge spoil, the Army Corps of Engineers reviewed their permit and recommended against it. And as a tree hugger, I'm usually not a fan of the Army Corps of Engineers, but in this case, they argued on environmental grounds. The gyp stack itself was not engineered. The stack contains hazardous and toxic material. There's documentation of past slope stability and piping issues. And the worst case scenario for Piney Point, they said, was if it received dredge spoil, was that there'd be a breach in the liner. And that's exactly what happened. And they said, and we fear that that would cause a mixing of large volumes of a dredge material and phosphogypsum. In the intervening years, when HRK and the state of Florida was trying to drain Piney Point, they were using a whole number of techniques, including barging out, I think it was 100 million gallons out into the Gulf on barges, and spray evaporation and sending it to wastewater treatment plants and so on. And they had gotten it down where they had substantially reduced the amount of effluent in the pond at the top of that stack. And then it was drained, and this liner was in place. And the liner sits on top of this is all gypsum here. And there's a pond at the top that gets the processed water. And this liner is what failed twice, once in 2011 and now in 2021. And so we are, that was due to the dredge spoil going in on top of that liner, precisely as the Corps of Engineers said they feared. It actually caused the liner to fail. And in the, I think this was the 2011 breach. And these are the ponds at Piney Point. And again, we have now the 2021 breach, and we are discharging, or they were discharging, not supposedly now we're no longer doing it, pumping water out through the port here from the pond, and actually some also went up Piney Point Creek. And the concentrations of nitrogen in this effluent was just incredible. Something like 200 times what we would normally expect to find in stormwater. And Robert Weisberg is a professor at University of South Florida Marine Science Center in St. Petersburg, and he models ocean currents and whatnot. And so this is showing the dispersion of the effluent that was pumped out at Piney Point. And then he's showing here the tidal prism coming in and out, and the sloshing back and forth of that effluent into Tampa Bay. And again, this, depending on how much effluent there is and tidal cycles and whatnot, would determine the amount of time, the residence time that polluted water stays in the bay. And the longer it stays in the bay, the more opportunity there is for it to help stimulate an algae bloom. These are the state of Florida Department of Environmental Protection has a website, as does the Tampa Bay Estuary Program. These are some of the sampling sites that they were sampling, still sampling some of them, but they initially were sampling for nitrogen, and that's how we know how much nitrogen was in that effluent. And they do not appear to still be doing sampling for nitrogen as they were previously. But this is the kind of data analysis that is available on the Tampa Bay Estuary Program Piney Point dashboard, and it's available to anybody that is interested enough to try and log on and look at what's happening. There are multiple agencies that are feeding data that's available on that site. And so the latest idea is that Manatee County has appropriated $9 million to build an injection well. And the injection well is to be completed within 330 days. And we have about 15 days before the start of the hurricane season. We've already seen in Riverview and in Mulberry what heavy rains and or hurricanes can do to gypsum stack. So I hope that that injection well is done before we have a substantial storm, or we'll be looking at another disaster. And I think the injection, this is just my personal opinion, the injection well is a great temporary solution, but it's not a permanent one. And that putting water that is not sufficiently treated to go into the bay or to be reused for useful purposes is not a solution in my mind. It's a storage mechanism. And again, luckily we're on the coast. If that injection well were to leak, the direction of flow is probably towards the bay, and so our risk would be much less than it would be in the central part of the state. So again, these are just my opinion and my personal recommendations concerning phosphate mining and Piney Point. And one is that we look at the Florida Veterans for Common Sense Urgency and Action, a drawdown to reverse global warming, where they recommend Cody Keller and John Deravec did a fantastic job, and they talk about regenerative agriculture, and I can't remember if they include landscaping, but I do. And so this is using natural methods, not using chemical fertilizers, but using a rotation of animals and crops and so on, and basically is organic agriculture. And there are now more and more farmers moving to this technique. And I just read an article that said that PepsiCo, who is the parent owner of Tropicana right here in town, is trying to encourage regenerative farming and agriculture in their suppliers. So we start to see already even large corporate farmers moving into it. But folks like Gabe Brown, who is a farmer in, I think, Minnesota, has 5,000 acres and is a regenerative farmer and doing quite well now that he has switched to regenerative farming, because it puts carbon back into the soil, and every 1% that we increase the organic matter in the soil, we hold another 25,000 gallons of water. So if phosphate is a strategic mineral, and if we absolutely need it to grow food, why are we shipping 75% of it out of this country? We should be mining and removing the uranium from the phosphoric acid, and then we should neutralize that acidity. And if once we've done that, we could reuse those nutrients, particularly the nitrogen, just as Marine Laboratories Aquaculture Park out Fruitville Road does, where they grow mangroves to treat their fish waste. So the mangroves are eating that ammonia again, same nitrogen product that we're concerned about from the phospho-gypsum stacks, and it could be used for productive purposes. And absolutely, we need to change our phosphate regulations to require all that I just said. We have allowed the phosphate industry to establish our regulations and to control our legislature for far too long. When I worked in the Florida House, the biggest party of the year was the phosphate stone crab party, and everybody wanted to get invited to that. That was all the booze and all the stone crab you cared to consume. And piling toxic material in a tall stack, as we continue to do, is not a solution. It's just a disaster waiting to happen. And again, we've seen, and I lost count there, 5, 6, 7 disasters already. And you know, a quote that was attributed to Albert Einstein was, "The definition of insanity is to continue doing the same thing and expect a different outcome." And we've already seen what happens with our gypsum stacks, and particularly in storms and heavy rainfalls. And another question that's worth thinking about is, what are we doing with our phosphate severance tax? When phosphate is mined, it pays, there's a severance tax paid on it. And this is from the 2020 report by the State Department of Revenue. And for the last few years, the total collections have been in the $30 million range, with almost 10 million of that going to general revenue. I don't know what we're doing with that money, but I bet it's not helping us to remove these phospho-gypsum stacks from Florida. We're adding, again, 30 million tons a year to the phospho gypsum that's already piled up there, and waiting for the next disaster to happen. And here's the phosphate severance tax distribution as dictated in statute. And so, again, a good portion of it's going to the general revenue fund. And in my opinion, our legislature has not done a good job of managing our money. We had a constitutional amendment saying we ought to be putting money into buying environmentally endangered lands, and they've failed to do that, and on and on. But at any rate, this is how we are distributing the severance tax money. That's a real quick and dirty synopsis of phosphate mining, the history of it, the problems attributable to it. We've only had one failure that I'm aware of a clay settling area. Again, clay settling areas are mountains like that phospho gypsum stack I showed. And in 1971, one and pretty well wiped out the Peace River. And so that also, because it smothers anything that's in the river when you dump all that clay into a river system. So, any questions?
One thing that I would say, Jack, number one, can everybody hear me? I hope. But thank you very much, Jack. I mean, that's a lot of information to absorb, but it's very important for us. I mean, this Peace River spill, many people may not know it, but the Peace River is a large percentage of our water supply in Sarasota County. And so.
That's correct. And that's why Sarasota County got involved in challenging a permit in, I think it was 2008, along with Lee County. And our concern was trying to protect the Peace River because it is part of our drinking water supply. And what we asked of Mosaic was the company that owned the mine. We asked them to stay out of wetlands and particularly bayheads. And they said it was not economically feasible to do that in a state court. That's what they told the judge. That's what they testified. And at the same time, Sierra Club was pursuing a federal case under the Clean Water Act. And subsequently, the case was settled and they agreed to stay out of the wetlands. So as I think about what can we believe and who determines what is economically feasible, you know, because I'm sure that the mine companies would say it's not economically feasible to remove the uranium, for instance. But you know, who's determining that? Does that mean they have a smaller profit margin than they otherwise would, but they could conceivably do it? So, yeah.
Jack, does anybody have a number on how much these phosphate mines have cost the state of Florida for all this legacy cleanup? Has anybody even thought about that?
Not that I know of. I did not try to total up, and it's very hard going back in time. And for instance, you know, just finding some of those old spills. The U.S. Geological Survey has a lot of old reports, and but it would be in the many hundreds of millions of dollars, I'm sure. You know, that in many instances, the taxpayers have picked up. There are fines levied usually in those cases, but I can't believe that it actually pays all of the costs for all of the people and their time and their lost business and so on. And we know that the Department of Environmental Protection with Piney Point started out early on. They spent, the numbers I was seeing was $200 million. And that was in the early days when they had to take it over from Mulberry Phosphate. So, and just think about, again, 24 phosphogypsum stacks, massive things. And what would happen if we had a Category 5 hurricane go up the central part of the state and have, I don't know, take a number out of that 24, 2, 3 stacks, you know, that leak and cause massive problems. It could be huge, and a huge economic disaster for the state. And it still is. We are, again, adding 30 million tons of phosphogypsum per year. That's just incredible, you know. And
Richard, are there some questions?
Yeah,
in
we
the
have
question?
one from Cody Keller. He
Okay.
wants to know, where does the injection go? And does it threaten the aquifer?
the injection well is, and I'm not sure what the depth is. One number I saw was 3,000 feet. So, so I am just not a fan of taking something, again, a waste product that is hazardous. And again, I haven't seen to what level they're going to treat that effluent prior to discharge down the well. And once it's in the ground, below the ground, who knows what's happening? They are theoretically monitoring at the perimeter of their property. When that 2016 sinkhole happened and 215 million gallons disappeared into the aquifer, they said none of it had they could not find any passing the boundary of their property. You know, well, where is it, and is it going to stay there? And so I think it does put aquifers at risk when you put something at high pressure. Again, you know, is it neutralized? Exactly what kind of treatment will it have before it goes into the aquifer? And I'm not privy to that specific information, but I'm just not a fan of injection wells, and particularly when we have, you know, nitrogen is, we are spending a lot of fossil fuels to make nitrogen fertilizer. Why would we pump a lot of it down into the ground? You know, to me, those kinds of things don't make sense. And again, when we pressurize a system, and if it continues to be at all acidic, and we open up caverns, there's certainly a reason to be concerned in my mind. You know, yes, they're theoretically monitoring it, but how many things have we monitored and it was fine until it wasn't? And again, if that, you know, if the well leaks, could it be a little bit, or could it be catastrophic? I don't know, you know, and we don't. So putting toxic material into our, and it's going below the potable zone. So, you know, again, all of Florida is underlain by salt water. We're sitting on a bed of limestone. If you go deep enough, you will hit salt water at some point. And so they're going down through the potable part of the aquifer, freshwater part, into the saltwater part, and theoretically way below. But, you know, we've certainly heard lots of concern about fracking and pumping things into the ground. And what does that do in terms of potential earthquakes or seismic events of some kind, and so on. So yeah, Cody, I think personally, I am not a fan of injection wells. Again, I think in this case, as at least a short-term measure, I like it better than having a major disaster that threatens people and or threatens to stimulate our red tide. But I think when we think that we are throwing things away, I think there is no away anymore. So we're storing it underground until something happens.
Jack, how many phosphate companies are active in Florida now?
You know, there is only one in the Bone Valley area, to my knowledge, and that's Mosaic. They have consolidated, bought up a number of other mining companies. And I'm unclear, I just have not had any, frankly, interest in the North Florida. There are phosphate mines in North Florida, and or there were. And if they're still mining, I think that's another company. So there may be two. There's one or two, I believe, that mine phosphate. You know, we used to mine heavy metals, titanium and other things, again, in Northeast Florida. Peat, we mined peat and so on, lots of things. But one or two phosphate companies are doing all of the mining. And again, they, you know, they spent an awful lot of money in that case where Lee and Sarasota County wanted to try to protect the Peace River. Mosaic spent an awful lot of money to prevent us from succeeding in getting them to stay out of the wetlands. And, you know, I don't know how many million they spent, but it seems to me that if they would spend more money on doing those kind of things and less on parks and providing money and getting their name on green things, I think we'd probably have better end result in Florida.
So Jack, Ann Taylor has a question. She wants to know, are federal super funds available to correct the damage caused by the liner leak? And has there been any effort to tap into this fund?
You know, I have to confess, I do not know the specific answer to that. I don't know. I haven't kept up on Superfund stuff. And I don't, nor do I know how well funded the program is over the last few years, both at the federal and certainly at the state level. We have done an abysmal job of funding those kinds of projects. And there's real concern as climate continues to change, as we inundate more and more Superfund sites and contaminated sites, that we would have enough money to adequately remedy our problems. So I don't know the answer. I'd be happy to try and find it, but I have a feeling like there isn't enough money in Superfund to go to a single project like our Phospho gypsum stacks and even Piney Point. I mean, if the state already spent $200 million the first time, and I'm not sure how much more they have spent since then, and the county likewise. You know, we're talking easily billions of dollars. And one of the things I had heard was that Mosaic was being required to pay into a fund until it reached 1.8 billion, I think, to help basically act as a bond. I'm not sure what the right word would be, to cover disasters. And, you know, the fact that we need to be doing those things is enough of a concern. I would rather they pay for it and that their stockholders pay for it than the rest of us have to pay for it. But if we need upwards of a $2 billion bond, we should be concerned about the risk that we are allowing ourselves, and it's not decreasing, it's increasing every year. We're continuing to mine and continuing to add phosphogypsum to those stacks. So they are not decreasing for the most part, they're increasing over time.
Jack, it sounds like to me that this phosphate business, so many of these phosphate companies have declared bankruptcy when they have a problem, that it looks like they take the profits and then leave the externality of the external costs to the taxpayers. Is that fair to say? Is that a reasonable summary?
That's exactly right. Yes, that they have been able to do that. And again, when we allow them to accumulate such a liability, I mean, piling up the phosphogypsum is not a solution any more than if we were piling up, you know, spent nuclear power plant fuel rods in a single location and just letting them sit there, which we may, I think, do on some sites to a much smaller extent. But anyway, that's just not a solution. So we are allowing a huge liability to accrue. And unfortunately, the deep pockets are the government. And we ought not allow that to happen. We as voters, we as taxpayers ought to refuse to continue to pick up the tab for a company that is able to file bankruptcy and walk away. And we just should, in my mind, there is not a reason why they couldn't, as I was suggesting in my recommendations, remove the toxic materials, neutralize the acidity, and use that phosphogypsum. And there previously, when we were mining, and I think we're still mining some in North Florida, the North Florida phosphogypsum, phosphogypsum was lower in radionuclides than the stuff in Bone Valley. And so they were able to use theirs for, at least for agricultural soil amendment. All the calcium in there apparently is good for peanuts and things. And so there's just no reason in my mind that we shouldn't be removing the radionuclides and making positive use of them. We use uranium in nuclear power plants, and we're mining it somewhere. And rather than leaving it in the phosphogypsum where it's a serious liability, we ought to be using it for productive things. And that liability is just huge, and that's why the companies are going bankrupt. I mean, they have such a huge risk, and why we, again, as voters and taxpayers, have allowed them to continue to do that. Well, I do understand politics, but yeah, that's the political failure that we started out talking about, you know, that they have been able to control legislation in the state of Florida and regulation. So they continue to pile it up and make more money that way.
Well, Jack, thank you very much. That was a terrific talk, very informative. It's a lot for us to absorb, but we should be more informed about it. Further announcements, we'll call an end to the meeting. And thank everybody for attending tonight. And thank you, Jack. I knew that talk took a lot of time and work. So
Thanks,
excellent
Jack.
job. Okay, good night, everybody.
Good night.
See you next month.